Looks like it's time for us to begin this morning. We are continuing in our studies in the book of Nehemiah. We're on lesson number 6 today. We'll welcome everyone to the class, and I'm appreciative of everyone's willingness to come out and the preparations you've made to be in class today. And we'll continue the study. Decidedly old school. Dan's really brought a lot of slide game this time, and I decided not to compete. I just choose not to play in the game. But I've been really impressed with the material that he's brought together to review for us and to give us a more vivid picture of the work that's underway with the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. The mission in Nehemiah, even being particularly the simulated drone views, I guess, of the building of the rebuilding of the walls and the gates and such has really I think helped to make the project come alive and not seem so much just an academic and on paper exercise. So I commend Dan and his choice of supplemental materials, and we'll get along without them decidedly more old school with more hand waving and such this morning. Before we begin, let's start with a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for every way you've been mindful of us, but especially for the life and the health that we enjoy and the ability to assemble here in peace and in quiet and consider things from your word. Pray that you'll bless our proceedings, that we'll come to a better understanding of your word, be better equipped to render service to you and to each other in particular. In particular, Father, we pray that our faith in you will be reinforced, and we'll be better equipped, better prepared to be able to answer people who might ask us why we believe the way that we do. We pray, Father, that you will be with those who are traveling away from us, who are ill or have been hindered from attending with us, and would remove those hindrances as quickly as possible. Indeed, Father, if one of us could be of service in doing that, we'll pray that will be the case. Father, forgive us of our sins. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Okay, up to this point, given what we studied so far, what's the turning point that we've arrived at in terms of the stage of the narrative in Nehemiah and the action we've seen so far? Okay, the walls are finished. This is around, and lots of dates have been floated around 520, 516 or so. And you remember the return? Remember about when the folks returned from captivity? About 52 years earlier. And I gave the earlier date, the 516 is really the establishment of the temple, and then now this is about another several decades have passed now that is taken for the walls to be built. Now, why is it that thanks, Chris, for the reminder. Why is it that that there was such a delay between the laying of the foundation of the temple and the completion of the walls? What kind of obstacles did they have to overcome? Themselves. You may remember that when some of the first messages from the prophets were consider your ways. And when they had basically, because of the opposition, because of the people threatening and making fun of them, and even organizing and getting some government sanctions against them proceeding to work, they'd kind of given up on building the temple. They had made a great start, a very impressive start in making the trip all the way back to Judah and to organizing themselves and laying the foundation for the temple. But then when the opposition came up, they stopped work. And what did they do in the meantime? Did they go back home? They built their houses. They set up shop. And God said, do you think there's something wrong here that you've got nice places to live in? You've even finished them on the inside. You not just put up the structures and protected against the elements. You made them nice on the inside, and my place is still sitting at the foundations. And so the lesson is consider your ways, and pointed out the fact that you've been wondering maybe why you're not been prospering, why life's so hard here when you return to Judah. Many of you maybe have never lived here. Some of you may have heard stories from your parents about the way it was before, but this used to be a pretty good place to live, right? In terms of its prosperity, its capability as far as the fertileness of the ground and the elements and the kind of life that people could expect to live when they lived in Jerusalem. Jerusalem's been occupied for a long time. Jerusalem's been occupied for well over a millennia at this point, mostly by the children of Israel, but I mean, they've been the primary occupants, but it's been occupied. It's been a good place to live for a long time. And why is it so harsh now? Well, God says, consider your ways. I've not blessed you because you're not doing what's pleasing to me. What other? I mentioned about the political opposition that they had, the physical neighbors who had a lot of hostility. They were able to organize and basically slander the children of Israel, and saying that, if you if you let these people build, you just check their track record. You ask the people who used to live here, or the people that conquered them last. You ask them what kind of tenants they are, how they behave themselves, and there's probably a case to be made for that. That maybe, particularly if you'll ask the last few years about the way Judah behaved itself. If you ask Babylon, how those people behaved, or how Judah was, they would probably say, yeah, they're just a pain in my side. They're difficult people to get along with. They're constantly pushing back. They don't pay the tribute on time. They're rebellious. I can't recommend them. I wouldn't recommend that you take them on. Why, you suppose you could go back and ask the Assyrians? Well, the Assyrians didn't conquer Judah, by the way. They were enemies to them, but they didn't conquer them. Why couldn't you ask the Assyrians? They're gone. The nation, think about that, the nation that humbled the northern kingdom, decimated the nation that God described in the book of Isaiah as the rod of my anger. They're gone. Babylonians tread them underfoot. And they displaced them just like they displaced the children of Israel. So really, you can't go back and ask them, but you could perhaps ask some of the Babylonians, and that's the case that they made. Just ask the Babylonians about how rebellious these people are. And went back and looked at the record and say, well, yeah, there was a lot of problems there. So maybe we ought to halt the work. But that overlooked the fact that they were rebuilding the temple under the decree of the reigning kingdom in the first place. And it's actually that discovery of that decree that allowed them to continue their work to be able to rebuild the temple. Now then they rebuild the temple, and the folks are living around in their villages and houses and such, but the walls are still in ruins. The walls are still a wreck. And it's at that point that getting this report that Nehemiah swings into action. This report from his brother about the state of the city really disturbed him. And that's what we've been studying the past 2 weeks. Basically, how one man, his vision, his plan of action, he was able to be able to bring to bear. And really, if you don't, there's lots of things we can say that are on the plus side of Nehemiah's ledger. But his determination, his purpose, his fixation on completing the mission is really strong. Now you see his generosity, his thoughtfulness, his godliness in the pursuit, his prayerfulness, his preparation, his sympathy for injustices. There's all kinds of other things that recommend him as a stellar governor and a stellar man. But his fixation, he was not to be deterred. And I'm impressed, and Dan Sands helped us with this, I'm impressed with the thoroughness of this record. You skip over the genealogies, didn't you? You just kind of, you saw it started out with the first dozen names, and you scanned down to the bottom, and you said, well, okay, that's a bunch of people I don't know anyway. There's a tendency to kind of do that, but this was a historical record. And ironically, in our lesson today, we go back and pick up the genealogy, really, that Ezra brought with him. That was a matter of record. That was the official record. And so people who contested, the next generation or the next generation that contested what happened here and who was involved with it would be able to go back and look at pretty much the official records to determine what it is that they were doing and what they were supposed to be doing and how they accomplished it. And the giving of credit for the people that worked on the wall. Even I got to admit, I hadn't noticed the number of people that doubled up. And my skipping over the genealogies and skipping over those details to get to the rest of the story, I hadn't noticed those things that Dan shared with us. But the amount of effort that the people had a willingness to work. It wasn't just that Nehemiah was a slave driver. He was absolutely beating on people all the time to be able to get this thing done in the shortest possible time. He convinced them in the need, and they all leaned in and worked together, or very nearly all. They were not without their oppositions. There were still some people, some pockets of resistance, even among Israelites, the returning people of Judah, that still were resistant to it. So having completed the temple, having completed the walls for the city, what's the first order of business in today's lesson? Setting up the watch. Is it, having the walls built and the towers built and the defenses in order, you still have to enact them. You still have to have a culture where you have to have a protocol, a means of being able to use those defensive effectively. The enemies didn't just give up. They didn't just evaporate. The need for the walled city was still there. And even though it may not have been as glorious as what they remembered from, or what might have been talked about from the days of Solomon, it was still a place to be reckoned with. It was still a desirable place to live. And as evidenced by the fact that here now, even with government backing, the folks of Judah have reoccupied their territory, which is not, the surrounding nations did not view that as saying, well, at least someone moved into the old place and spruced it up. It wasn't something that other people, the nations around them, were happy to see. As a matter of fact, being able to accomplish this, the building of the walls in such a short period of time, particularly after they'd lain in ruin for much longer, the area was occupied for much longer than it took to build the walls. And there was at least some comfort there. Where say, it's not good that those people are back, but at least they've kind of been put down. They know their place, and we don't have to worry about them as being a force to be reckoned with. But being able to rebuild the walls in 52 days and to go from basically a force not to be reckoned with when now they've got a walled city in protection. And even worse, the other conclusion you might draw is that their God helped them. They weren't shy about giving credit where credit's due, about what the purpose is. They didn't just want to have a wall so they didn't have to worry about somebody breaking in and robbing the stores overnight. That wall represented protection. That wall represented an autonomy and an ability, an identity that the children of Israel had been lacking now for, a century or so. That's significant. And so now they've got the means of being able to protect themselves. And so they've got a protocol for when they open the gates and when the gates are closed, and a rotation of the guard and the outfitting. I didn't exactly understand as to why you needed porters and singers at the gates, but they got them. That's the way that was part of what was set up. The need for those understanding of when the gates would be open and closed were important for the autonomy and for the sense of protection that we have from living in the city. However, how many people lived in the city comparatively? Was it a crowded, bustling place? Not enough, not very many. The predominant number of people living in the city appear to be the Levites. And that kind of makes sense because they're the ones that are tasked with a lot of the temple duties. And so that's where the temple is and that's where they work, so living in the suburbs or living close to where you work kind of makes sense. But unfortunately, now you've got a impressively rebuilt city walls with gates and towers, but relatively few people living in it. So Nehemiah goes back to the genealogy. He goes back to the looking, considers the number of people that he might recruit to be able to put and actually live in the city and make it a vibrant, thriving place again. So the city having been that's the kind of getting ahead of us a little bit. The having set up the order and the protocols, the means of protection of the city, when the gates would be open and closed, and how that would operate, there was an attention given to the law, and we see Ezra being mentioned again here. And you may have noticed in one of the footnotes here that Ezra has not been on the scene for a while. You kind of wonder, well, Ezra came and he motivated the people to be able to rebuild the temple, or as part of that, and there's been God sent prophets to motivate them to complete the temple and such. Well, where's Ezra been in the meantime? And it's kind of been suggested by several of the commentators that he was recalled back to the royal court. that having duties and having been established and having a reputation, having basically accomplished the mission that he was sent out to do, that he was called back for service. But at this point now he's back in Jerusalem. And that befitting that, then Nehemiah turns to him for a reading of the law. And this is beginning in chapter 8. This is an impressive scene. They built a pulpit for him, erected a wood platform for him to be able to be above folks. And folks gathered at the square before the Watergate, which is, you may remember from the city and from the diagram on page 31, the Watergate's down at the kind of the bottom skinnier, at the top of the skinnier portion of the city. So you might imagine that when the people gathered there, in any kind of numbers at all, they probably packed the place. It probably was a pretty crowded scene, although the city had a lot more area in it, but the place that they chose to be able to read the law was probably packed. And there's this very solemn reading. For the first time, I'm thinking that probably for a lot of the people in the audience, it was the first time for them to have had the law read to them in this fashion. Of actually having, and I don't think it all happened bam in one day. It just looks to me like it would be a several day occurrence because it looks like they did it in phases. And I think that you could probably read a good portion of the law if you just, you sat down in the quiet, had a comfortable chair and something to drink and, the air-conditioned house. You could probably read that portion, read the books of the law in one sitting, maybe in a day. But this is a crowd, and it's outdoors, and it's hot, and you got to take breaks, and I mean it's a lot of logistics that go along with reading this. So it sounds like it's kind of a one and done kind of thing, but I think it was over the course of several days, and particularly the way that Ezra reads the law. And then we're told that Levites and priests explained the law. They ensured that the people understood it. So I'm kind of thinking that there's a kind of a paragraph by paragraph procession through the law. Now, what did they read? It just says the law of Moses, but what do you think? What do you think that they read? Which books? The 5 books, the first 5 books, but I think there's probably an emphasis on Leviticus because that's where a lot of the bylaws and subsections and a lot of the rules were, and a lot of the things that were cited in particular that they bound in the covenant at the end of this section, at the end of chapter 10. That's where a lot of those regulations were read from, although some were from Numbers. And some were from Deuteronomy, which is kind of a summary of Exodus and Leviticus. And Numbers is Deuteronomy's recap, or Moses' recap. And so this is the source material that they read. And I'm thinking for many of them, it was hearing this for the very first time. That their identities as Jews, even if they were alive back before Jerusalem fell, which is possible at this point in history, it's possible that some of these people were children then, and that whatever their identity they were able to maintain as exiled Jews, as captives in a foreign land, but now they're actually hearing the law in its context from an expert. Remember, Ezra's not a casual. He's just not got a good reading voice. Ezra is an expert in the law. And with other people whose job it was to understand what those regulations were and could explain them to you if you didn't understand. This is a pretty powerful moment. It's akin to the casting of the covenant at Mount Sinai, in my eyes, in which the children of Israel formally made that covenant, the covenant that you will be our God and we will be your people. There's that kind of recognition. There's that kind of solemnity. There's that kind of commitment to surfaces from this powerful reading of the law, don't you think? Did you get that sense at all in reading this? That this was a renewing of the vows. Did that stand out to you at all? That this is for people who maybe didn't really understand why their heritage was such that it is. Maybe they really didn't understand the point why it is that God singled them out. That's all rehearsed here. That's all part of the delivery and part of what's gone over in this exercise. Fred?
God has always been very good about explaining what he wants his people to do. And I see this kind of point where God can say, now you know what it is, and I'll try and live it.
Well, and even the when the law had fallen into almost like the reading of the law under Josiah. After it, Josiah's dad didn't have a whole lot of use for law, and so nobody had probably read it out loud in a long time. But when Josiah got the king's copy of the law and had it read to him, it was moving, and it moved him into action. And we see the same kinds of things here with these people. And what was their reaction? Okay, this is as in chapter 8 and verse 9, the people began to realize the full depth of where they had come from. Some of them, again, some of them had perhaps lived it, or at least had been born in captivity, or had been, influenced to saying, if you ever get a chance to get out of here and go back to Judah, take it. Just take it. Take my word for it. It's a great place. You want to go. And maybe that there was an expectation. Maybe there's really, they maybe had an understanding of what it's all about, but now that's coming in, it's removing all doubts. You're getting a clarity now of what we're doing here, who we are, that they didn't have before. That only the law of God, only God's revelation can give to people. And it had the expected reaction. The people responded to it in a strong way. And Ezra says that don't weep. This is a day to celebrate. And so they began to enjoy this gathering, and realizing as part of the law then that they happened to be in the 7th month, in which two of the very important feasts were going to be held. And so they persisted. They dropped what they did, dropped what they were doing, and they persisted in the city to be able to observe these feasts. Now, what's the first feast that it talks about? The Feast of Tabernacles, or Booths. And the idea is kind of a lot like what we might think of camping out. You decided not to stay in your house, but you would come to Jerusalem and you would build booths. You would build a temporary shelter. And this booth might just be a frame with some leaves on it. They talked about getting leafy, the leafy branches and such, and making shelters for themselves. And they did this to commemorate the time that the children of Israel lived like this as they wandered the wilderness and as they journeyed to the Promised Land. Then what was the second feast? The Day of Atonement. Again, a very, very important. This is the most important day in the temple. The temple they get all sacrifices and such, but the Day of Atonement is the most important day on the temple itinerary. That's where the high priest goes in before the Lord and makes this sacrifice. It's basically for the sins of the people to roll their sins forward as a nation. It's a very, very important feast. And I was thinking, interestingly enough, about these feasts, that the Day of Atonement was this almost national type holiday and such. But the other feasts, the Feast of Passover and the Feast of First Fruits, what we know in New Testament times was Pentecost, were times in which every able-bodied male was required to come to the temple, or actually the tabernacle before that. God required the presence of every able-bodied male for these feasts. And I was reminded of this kind of suggestion it doesn't talk about, but what do you suppose the enemies, the neighbors, were thinking while all this is going on? If you just think like a bad guy. This is something we do as part of our cybersecurity exercises. Put your bad guy hat on, okay? If you were an enemy of these folks and you saw them all gathering in one spot, what would you think about doing? That's one thing. You'd wonder what they're up to. But maybe you send a spy in there, somebody to get a good look, and you find out, well, they're just all living in tents and celebrating and enjoying each other's company. What else would you think about doing? If you wanted to take their stuff, if you wanted to attack them, then that'd be the time, right? You may remember in the Roman siege of Jerusalem in the AD 70s when the Romans would basically stay out of range until the Sabbath day, and then they'd rush right up to the wall and start working on their towers and undermining the wall. Why did they do that? Because the Jews were forbidden they couldn't defend themselves on the Sabbath. They couldn't do any work. And so you don't have to worry about somebody dropping a rock on your head or shooting at you with an arrow or even dumping their trash on you. They weren't allowed to do those things. And so for this time, when all the able-bodied men were supposed to come and be a part of this feast, that would be a prime time to take their land, to take their farms from them. In Exodus, the 34th chapter, though, dating all the way back to in the days of Moses, when God promised to the Israelites, it says, when I require your presence before me, your neighbor will not covet your property. And that's astounding to me. That's absolutely amazing. You know, how would they want it the other 49 weeks of the year, but suddenly not find it inconvenient to be able to try to steal their property while they're away at honoring their commitment to their God? Well, God didn't necessarily go in and force them, put up some kind of invisible barrier so they couldn't come on Israelite property. It didn't have to exercise things in a supernatural way. He could just give them something else to worry about, like, I don't know, fire or famine, frogs. There are other neighbors who decided to choose that particular time to attack them. There's all kinds of ways that God provided distraction, but he gives this promise to the children of Israel, even from the outset. Back when Moses is instituting all this, he said, don't worry about your property. You can worship God in all confidence and trust that he will take care of you. And that seems to be appropriate here too. When you got everybody from the countryside gathering in the city, packed in there tight, enjoying each other's company and listening to the law being read and recommitting themselves to service God, you'd think, well, that's a golden opportunity for all these enemies to come in and equalize the situation, son. But I think that promise is still holding true because it's part of God's law. It's a promise that he made to them and his commitment to his people. And we see that exercised here. We don't read about them having to, feast with their weapons on, or to keep one eye on the gate and work with one hand, as it were. They've got the means of protecting themselves by the city now is able to fend off attacks, but nobody bothers to attack during these feasts. During this time they're spending most of the month. The people are spending most of the month, the 7th month, in the city of Jerusalem, and yet nobody bothers to throw a rock. At least that is recorded for us. I think that's pretty impressive. So we have the recording of the celebration of the Feast of Booths, and the following. That was 7 days that they observed that feast, and then there was a day of solemn worship that followed that. This day of the solemn fast, and with the confession of sin that begins in chapter 9. Is there anything else about the reading of the law and instituting of these feasts that stood out to you? I don't want to buffalo that. There's a lot of really good material here, but things go as, given the success that they've enjoyed to this point, God continues to bless their efforts. Things go as planned. They have the desired result. The people are responsive to the law. They don't say, well, that was then, it was thou, that was in ancient times, and that may be my people. My great-great-great-grandfather may agree to this, but I'm just not in. I'm not down for this. That's not their response at all. They begin to recognize through God's commitment, the description of the covenant and a reminder of the promises that God kept, of all the things, what their identity was, why they were there. David?
I can't help but think it. I don't know whether the providence of God and all this happened in the time frame that it did or what, but they finished the wall in the 6th month. And then you come to the 7th month, where you have, in the law, you have this Feast of Tabernacles, and then they had to come.
I think I see where you're going.
But to me, it's all like God saying to them, you've come this far, you've got the law completed, now it's time to go back to the feast, it's time to go back to the law, and remember who you are and where you came from, and remember all of those things, and turn back to God, and put your faith in God. He's going to take care of all these other things while you're doing that, just like what you were saying.
Certainly. And that's this idea of having worked 6 months, and then on the 7th month, kind of like the remembrance of the model, like of the Sabbath. It's time not to rest. They were busy. They were plenty active, learning the law and performing all the sacrifices and gathering woods and performing their duties and such. It wasn't a complete rest, but it was certainly a very internal and spiritual focus for them for these feast days. I started out with a confession that I skipped over the genealogies. The genealogies end up being really important, and not just giving credit where credit's due for doing the work. Why are genealogies so important? Why would genealogies be important to these people? Okay. This nation, these people were descendants, they were people of promise. And the promises had been made to their ancestors going back to Abraham. Right? So that entitled them as these descendants of promise to have an expectation about what that covenant would be. Go ahead, Chris. That's all. What other reasons can you think of? Who can be priests? And we actually have an occasion here that's described to us of someone who made the claim but couldn't produce the paperwork. And so until they were able to get better information, ever get an actual word of God get delivered through a priestly mean, like the Urim and Thummim, the author, at least one of the sources I looked at, said that the Urim and Thummim, those jewels that were in the breastplate that the high priest wore, that they may not have had access to them here. And so they might have had to wait for some other revelation from God, some prophet to come and be able for God to reveal his will to them in that way. But that's the kind of thing that they were looking for, to be able to ascertain as to whether or not this person to be able to serve or not. So the tribe that you belong to was important. And as it turns out, and you may remember in the occupation of the land, they divided up the land into pieces and they cast lots for them. And the genealogies were critical to prove that you belonged on your piece of property. If you wanted to stay on the family manse, you had to keep up with your genealogy to be able to prove that you had the bona fides to be able to be there. So that was important. Less important to these folk, because this is just a fraction of the territory that they occupied back in those days. And so it's not like you're going to make a claim on Gad and go out and say, I'm claiming the family farm again. That's not likely to happen, and probably you're not going to enjoy the protection of the government or even God's blessing in being able to do that. Because the terms that God said, you can dwell here as long as you want, providing that you follow me. Those were the terms. And they had fallen down. And the reading of the law, the reading and the realization of their history, they realized that. They realized that their part of their identity as a people was a failure to be able to uphold their vow. Which gives them an opportunity here for a do-over, for a fresh start, to make a new commitment. And in chapter 9, that's what you see. You see this this kind of a dividing up the day at the top of page 32. About 1/4 of the day they read from the law, for 1/4 of the day they confessed their sins, and 1/4 of the day that they worshiped in chapter 9 and verse 3. Well, they got another 1/4 of a day, but even counting just the daylight hours, there's stuff that you got to do as a grown-up to be able to accomplish these other things. That the time that you spend 3/4 of the day in study and worship to God, you still got other things that you have to take care of, like eating and sleeping and gathering wood for sacrifices and the like. So they make this, after having all this learning and all this explanation of the law and such, they make a confession here. This confession is recorded for us beginning in chapter 9, verse 5, and it's a good model. I think it's a good model for us to consider as we approach God, and the manner in which we may want to fashion our prayers or our worship to Him. And first of all, it addresses and it praises God for His accomplishments, and then it's an acknowledgement of wrongdoing. It's acknowledgement of the fact that we fall short of the law. That despite our best efforts, but sometimes we don't even try very hard, but we fall short. That just as broken creatures, as folks that are in need of God's mercy and forgiveness, that we recognize that. We acknowledge that before God. Then there's a petition to God that that the in the last beginning at verse 32 of chapter 9, that they basically appeal to him to honor and to remain in the covenant, and for God to continue to bless them and help them to fulfill their covenant. And that's the kind of construction that we see that's in model, it's in this prayer, or this confession. Notice that they go way back, go all the way back to Abraham. They really go back to God as creator, is where they start. But then saying that even after that, the reason why they are there is in some part due to the fact that they are descendants of Abraham, and God made these great promises to Abraham, and God keeps his promises. That's a tacit admission. That's one way of looking at God. That's a model for God. That's not everything you need to know about God, but those are some pretty important things to realize about God. He's his creator and the giver of blessings and the one who keeps his promises. And those promises oftentimes there are promises to destroy as well as promises to bless. And you can count, God's going to keep them. If you can't count on anything else, you can count on God keeping his promises. And then he talks about their deliverance from Egypt. He talks about the experience that they had at Mount Sinai and the provisions of manna for them. Even this is, how long ago is this in history? About 1,000 years. This is literally ancient history. Not just for us, it was ancient history for these people 1,000 years ago. But that's the starting point. That's the place that they call back to. And then there's this description of the rebellion. And they are warts and all. It's a warts and all look at their history. And they were a rebellious people. They needed correction often. Even though that God did great things for them. He took them to this land. He displaced the people that are in them. He gave them this rich land, vineyards that they didn't have to build, and houses that they didn't have to build, cities they didn't have to build, that they were able to come in, and because God displaced those people and gave the fruits of these spoils of this conquering of these other nations to the children of Israel, that they even had a claim on any portion of the land, including Jerusalem. But they call that to remind. Even when they set up shop, even after they had occupied the land, they still fell down. They still had rebellion. They still pushed back against God, and God would send people to oppress them to get their attention. And they would turn to God, and God would send deliverers during the period of the judges. And even from the period of kings, and is sending prophets to them and such, is constant appeal to them to come back and to honor their commitment that they had failed to do so. And ultimately that resulted in these people being cast away, these people being taken into captivity, their nations being destroyed, them being mightily displaced. And a recognition of that, I think, is important. This is a warts and all history. This is a very frank description of how we got here for these folks. And they don't try to, those enemies weren't really all that bad during the judges. That was just a power grab by some people inside of Israel that wanted better circumstances. There's no revisionist history here at all. This is a very frank look, a very frank evaluation of where they were. And it makes me kind of wonder if maybe some of the later books, like the book of Judges, might have been included in some of the reading offering. It doesn't say that explicitly, but they refer to that really in their reconciling of their history. Not a lot of mention for the kings, although they do mention the prophets. But then ultimately, the petition to God to restore and to set forth this renew their covenant, renew their vows, to set this covenant again with this remnant of his people. That's really, you think about it, this is, Jerry Clower used to say, I told you that so I could tell you this. This is, chapter 10 is why we came. If we couldn't get to chapter 10, then it's just a kind of a field trip. It's kind of an interesting exercise. But the whole point of people returning to Judah was a fulfillment of God's promises to them. And they weren't just supposed to return so they could say that they'd been there. Check that, get stamped on their passport or something. Say, yeah, I've been to Judah. Ancestral homeland, yeah, I've been there. It was neat, but then I'm going back. I'm going to live someplace else. The point was to restore them back to this place that God had prepared for them. And not just for the exercise, not just to say that, yeah, they named this place after you guys. or the name Jew after this place, rather. That's the other way around. The term Jew, I think, comes from having people from Judah. That somebody that used to live in Judah is a Jew, or that's where the term is thought to have come from. And so it's not just about the namesake. It was really about restoring these people back to this covenant relationship with God. The building of the temple, the building of the walls, even the return of the people, the keeping of the genealogies, determining all the particulars about how things should be done, which tribes are represented. And I don't know how these records were preserved with enough rigor to be able to do this, but it was important to some people to be able to accomplish this, to be able to demonstrate that you are from this nation. And it's not necessarily to get your names back, but the importance of the tribes, as pointed out, that who could serve as priests and who could serve as a Levite. That was also important, because Levites enjoyed certain privileges under the law as a tribe that God took for them. Does anyone remember why? Why the Levites get any special note or recognition? Trick question. It wasn't in the material. It is where the priests came from. The tribe, both Moses and Aaron, of course, being brothers, were from the tribe of Levi. But Moses wasn't qualified to be a priest. Aaron was, because he was the first one, but only people from Aaron's family could be priests. So you had the whole tribe of Levi, but this one family, this one descendant from one brother of the descendant, and Levi were qualified to be priests. But the rest of the Levites also enjoyed privileges. You may remember they weren't given land, they were given cities. They were given the responsibility of being able to work in the temple. But you remember why? When Moses came down from the mountain and found the people partying big time, and in his anger took up the sword and said, who is on God's side, assemble with me. And they went from one end of the camp to the other, killing everybody they came to. Do you remember who responded to the call? The tribe of Levi. God later redeems them for the firstborn in Israel. The rules were, in Exodus 13, that the firstborn of everything belonged to God. And in Numbers, God says, I will take the tribe of Levi as a swap for the firstborn of all the families in Israel. And so they were basically taken as a special tool for God in his service. And we see that, and that's the reason the genealogies are important again. One more reason why the genealogy is important, I've got to emphasize here, is that God made promises not just to Abraham or not just to the people of this land. He made promises to somebody in the tribe of Jesse, in the tribe of Judah. Remember, God told David, if there's a throne in my kingdom, your kin's going to sit on it. And so that gets to be really, really important. Again, for those chapters you skip over in Matthew and Luke, for those genealogies, that gets to be really important because Jesus' bona fides are tied up in these genealogies. And so we see that the genealogies were useful, not just in Jesus' time. They were useful for Ezra and Nehemiah and the reestablishment and the reinitiation of this covenant in Israel. So I hope that you have maybe a little more respect for those chapters that we've been skirting over, or at least realize the important, even if you aren't compelled to try to memorize them. I'm sorry I didn't give you very much time to talk this. To me, this is what the story is all about. That getting to this point is critical. This is why we left the house, is to see this point in God's history, for him to reestablish his full covenant with the remnant of people that he rescued from captivity. Dan will continue next week. Thanks.